On a Tuesday in late August, at my mother's kitchen table, I opened a piece of her mail, and 22 years cracked quietly open. I did not yell. I did not call my sister. I did not call my brother-in-law, who was the man whose name was at the bottom of the document I was looking at. I just sat there in my mother's kitchen, in the slanting 4 o'clock light, and I read the page 3 times. And then I folded it back into the envelope. And then I made the decision that everything else would come from. And what I did about it took 9 months, and I want to walk you through it. Welcome to Ruthless Retribution. If you're already with me at that kitchen table, a quick like genuinely helps. It's how stories like this travel. Tell me in the comments what you'd have done at 4 o'clock that afternoon. And don't be shy, the comment section on these is half the fun. Subscribe if you want more stories like this. Here is what I need you to understand before I tell you any of the rest of it. The man whose name was at the bottom of that page is my brother-in-law. He has been my sister's husband for 22 years. He gave the eulogy at my father's funeral in 2014 because, he said, my sister had asked him to. And I had nodded and said, sure, of course you should. You're better at that kind of thing than I am. He held my newborn nephew on his shoulder at the baby's first Easter brunch in 2007. And on that Tuesday in late August, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, sitting at my mother's kitchen table in the duplex she'd lived in since 1996, I found out that he had been quietly draining her revocable trust for almost 4 years, and that the total my father had spent 38 years of his life accumulating, dollar by dollar, on a high school principal's salary in Minnesota, came to $487,000. And the wild part isn't the theft. The wild part is what I decided to do about it. Because what I'm about to tell you only makes sense if you understand how small I had always been in his eyes. So let me back up. Let me back up a long way, because the only way any of this makes sense is from the beginning. My name is Paul Sutter. I am 52 years old. I have been a high school chemistry teacher for 26 years, at the same public school, in a 10th grade classroom on the 2nd floor of a 1957 brick building in a suburb west of Minneapolis. I have worn the same brown corduroy jacket every fall since the school year of 2009, when my then-girlfriend bought it for me at a Marshall Field's that no longer exists. The elbows are worn through now. I keep meaning to get them repatched. I live in the south half of a duplex on a quiet street, in the same suburb. The kid in the rental side is a graduate student in plant pathology at the U. We share a driveway and a snowblower. I did not finish my MBA. I want to tell you that now, because it matters later. I started it when I was 31, at a night school program at the university. I made it through 3 semesters. I dropped it the spring my father started having dizzy spells, and we all realized he was not going to be the man we'd assumed he was going to be for another 20 years. My sister Karen mentioned it once, at a Thanksgiving dinner in 2011. She said, "Paul, you were so close." And her husband Doug laughed across the table and said, "Karen, the man teaches sophomore chemistry. He doesn't need an MBA, he needs a hobby." And Karen laughed, and I laughed. I want you to know that I laughed at that joke because the man I became sitting at my mother's kitchen table on a Tuesday in late August 13 years later, that man had laughed at that joke for 13 years. Karen is 3 years younger than me. She is 49. She is a marketing director at a regional health insurance company headquartered in St. Paul. She makes about $300,000 a year. She and Doug live in a 5-bedroom house on a lake in Wayzata, which, if you don't know Minneapolis, is the suburb where everybody in Minneapolis assumes the people who live there made a different set of choices than they did. They have 2 children, my nephew and niece, 16 and 13, and a Bernese Mountain Dog that costs more every year in vet bills than my heating bill for the same year. They are not unkind people. Karen loves me. She loves me in the slightly distracted way you love an older brother who is fine, who is settled, who is no trouble. She remembers my birthday. She brought me a casserole every Tuesday for the first 3 weeks after my mother's stroke. She just married a man 22 years ago whose entire view of me has always been that I am fundamentally the small life next to her big one. Doug is 55, Doug Vance. He is an estate planning partner at a firm in downtown Minneapolis with 30 attorneys and a window office that looks out over the IDS Center. He plays golf at a private club in Edina that has a 6-figure initiation fee. He drives a Range Rover. He owns a silver Cartier money clip that he produces at every dinner check, every time, with the same small flourish, the same small wink at the waiter. He has, for as long as I have known him, treated me with a very specific kind of friendliness. He has been kind. He has been at my birthday dinners. He once drove 90 minutes in a snowstorm to bring me a battery jumper when my Civic died in the school parking lot in 2018. And he has been, the entire time, treating me the way you treat a footnote at the bottom of a page you are not particularly interested in rereading. My mother is Diane Sutter. She is 78. She lives now, has lived since the second week of July of this year, 2 months before that Tuesday I'm telling you about, in a memory care facility in Eden Prairie. She had a stroke on a Sunday afternoon. She was watering the African violets on her kitchen windowsill, and she fell sideways into the sink, and her neighbor's son found her about 40 minutes later when he came up the driveway to mow her lawn. She survived. She does not speak now. She makes small sounds. The first week she was in the facility, she still recognized me. By the 4th week, she was looking at me politely the way you look at a stranger who has come into your room. She has not recognized me since. My father was Edward Sutter. Ed. He was a high school principal in St. Paul for 33 years. He died on a Wednesday morning in March of 2014 of complications from a kidney infection that became sepsis between a Friday and a Sunday. He was 68. He was the kind of man who, every Saturday morning of his adult life, sat at his kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and a Bic pen and updated the household ledger by hand. He saved his whole life. He saved on a high school principal's salary in Minnesota, which is to say he saved by deciding every single year of his career not to buy a thing he could otherwise have bought. He paid off the house by 2001. He paid for half of Karen's wedding. And when he died, his entire estate went into a revocable living trust in my mother's name, a trust he had set up 4 years earlier, at the recommendation of my new brother-in-law, an estate planning partner downtown. The trust at the time of my father's death was worth a little over $620,000. Most of it was the proceeds from the sale of 2 rental duplexes my father had bought in the 80s and held for 30 years. The rest was a mid-6-figure brokerage account. The instructions in the trust document, and I had not, before that Tuesday in late August, ever actually read the trust document, said that the income from the trust would support my mother for the rest of her natural life, and that on her death, the remaining principal would be divided 50-50 between Karen and me. That was the only thing my father had ever asked Doug to do, professionally. He had said it to him at our kitchen table in 2010, 4 years before he died. I was there. I remember the dinner. My mother had made a pot roast and burned the gravy. He had said, "Doug, you take care of this thing for us. You make sure that whatever I leave goes to her and then to the kids equally. That's all I want." And Doug had nodded, and Doug had drafted the trust document. And Doug had been the successor trustee named in it. Successor trustee meant that if my mother became incapacitated, which, as of June, she had, Doug Vance was the person legally authorized to administer the trust on her behalf. He was the person who decided which assets to liquidate. He signed the checks. He answered to nobody. Because the only 2 people who could have asked him a question about what he was doing were, 1, my mother, who could no longer ask a question, and 2, my sister, who was married to him. I was a beneficiary of the trust. I was not a trustee. I had no signing authority. I had no statements mailed to me. I had, in the 11 years between my father's death and that Tuesday at my mother's kitchen table, asked Doug exactly twice how the trust was performing. Both times he had said, "Paul, it's doing what it's supposed to do. The income is covering her bills. We're all good." Both times I had said, "Great, thanks Doug, appreciate you handling it." Both times Karen had been standing next to him in a kitchen somewhere, smiling. I had not asked a third time. I want you to sit with that, because that is the part of this whole story that is on me. I had not asked in 11 years. He had been doing it for almost 4. The mail at my mother's house had been piling up in a small basket on her kitchen counter since the stroke in June. Karen had come by once the second week and taken the bills and the medical correspondence. The rest she had left in the basket. She said she'd get to it. She didn't. I came by on a Tuesday in late August, on my way home from a professional development workshop, to pick up some of my mother's houseplants. And while I was there, I made myself a cup of tea, and I sat down at my mother's kitchen table, and I went through the basket of mail. And 4 envelopes down was a quarterly statement from the trustee's office of Doug's firm, addressed to my mother in care of the trust. It was the kind of statement that should have been arriving at my mother's house every quarter for years. It was the first one I had ever seen. I opened it. I am a chemistry teacher. I am, by professional habit, a person who reads numbers carefully. Mr. Lindgren, my own high school chemistry teacher when I was 16, in another small Minnesota suburb in another century, had stood next to my lab bench one afternoon when I was titrating something and getting the measurement wrong, and he said, very quietly, "Paul, the measurement is the work, son. Everything else is showing off." I have thought about that sentence almost every day of my life since. And I thought about it that Tuesday afternoon at my mother's kitchen table when I opened that statement, because the measurement, on the 3rd line of the 2nd page, said consultant fee, $11,500. And the measurement on the 3rd line of the 2nd page of the previous quarter's statement, clipped behind it, said consultant fee, $12,200. And the one behind that said consultant fee, $9,800. And I sat there in my mother's kitchen, in the slanting 4 o'clock light, and I read those 3 lines 3 times each. And I knew, in the way you know things when you have been a chemistry teacher for 26 years, that there was no consultant. There had never been a consultant. There was only one person in the world who had the authority to write a check out of that trust and call it a consultant fee, and his name was at the bottom of the page. I folded the statement back into the envelope. I put the envelope back in the basket. I rinsed my teacup. I dried my teacup. I put it back in the cabinet where my mother kept her teacups for 40 years. I locked the back door. I drove home to the duplex. I sat at my own kitchen table in the dark for about an hour and I did not turn on the light. And then I got up and I made a sandwich and I graded 28 quizzes on stoichiometry and I went to bed at the normal time. And the next Sunday, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I drove out to Karen and Doug's house in Wayzata for our regular family dinner. I sat at their dining room table and I ate the roast Karen had made and slightly overcooked, and I drank a glass of the wine Doug had picked out. Halfway through the salad course, Doug looked at me across the table and said, "Paulie, how's the school year shaping up?" And he had called me Paulie for 22 years and I had never once asked him to stop, and I smiled at him. And I said, "Good, Doug, pretty good, same old, same old." And I took another sip of wine, and I did not say a single word about any of it to a single human being on this earth for 9 months, until the day I had everything I needed. So let me tell you who Doug was to me, and who I was to Doug for 22 years. Because I do not want you to think this story is the story of a man who hated his brother-in-law from the beginning. It isn't. It's a different kind of story than that, and it took me about 3 nights at my own kitchen table to figure out which kind. I drove home from Wayzata that Sunday night with my chest very still and my hands very still on the steering wheel, and I sat in my driveway for about 10 minutes before I went inside. And then I went inside, and I sat at my own kitchen table, and I started, not on paper, not yet, I started in my head. I started doing what I do when a student hands me a lab report and the numbers are off in a way that doesn't make sense. I started at the beginning and I went, one line at a time, through 22 years. The first time I met Doug was a Wednesday evening in the spring of 2002. Karen brought him to a dinner at my parents' house in St. Paul. She was 26. He was 33. He had just made partner at a different firm than the one he's at now, a younger firm, and he was wearing a suit that I now know, retrospectively, cost more than my Civic was worth at the time. And he came in carrying a bottle of wine I'd never heard of, and he shook my hand at the front door with both of his hands, and he said, "Paul, Karen's told me everything about you." And he had not, of course, been told everything about me. Karen had told him I was a high school teacher. He had assumed everything else. And he had walked into that dining room confident in his assumptions, the way Doug walked into every room of his life, confident in his assumptions. He married Karen the next year. He gave me a Christmas present that December, the first Christmas we shared as in-laws, of a leather-bound copy of Atlas Shrugged with a little card tucked inside the front cover. The card said, in his handwriting, "For Paulie, figured a man with 3 semesters of MBA under his belt could use a primer. Welcome to the family, Doug." I want you to know I read that card 3 times that Christmas morning at my parents' kitchen table, and I laughed, and I said to Karen, "Your husband is something else." And Karen had laughed and said, "He means it as a joke, Paul, you know how he is." And I had said, "Of course he does, of course he does." And here is the thing I figured out at my own kitchen table at midnight, that Sunday after Wayzata. Every single one of the small humiliations of 22 years, individually, was a joke. Individually, they were nothing. Individually, you could have written them off, the way I had written every single one of them off, every single time, for 2 decades. The leather-bound Atlas Shrugged. The Christmas in 2008 when Doug gave my then-girlfriend a Tiffany necklace and gave me a coffee table book about golf. The family vacation in 2017, Karen, Doug, the kids, me, to a resort in Sedona where Doug paid for the entire trip and then made one small joke at every dinner, every single dinner, 6 dinners, about how my MasterCard was getting a vacation too. The night in 2019 my niece's school had a father-daughter dance and her actual father was in a depot until 11 and Doug had called me at 9 in the evening to say, "Paulie, you free to step in? You're better at that kind of thing than I am anyway." And I had gone, and my niece had been 13 years old and she had been crying in the parking lot when I picked her up. And I had taken her, in my brown corduroy jacket, into that gym. And we had danced to one song, and then I had taken her home, and I had not said a single word to Doug about how he should have left work. None of those things individually was a thing. It was the stack that was the thing. It was 22 years of stack. And the cigarette lighter, I mean the money clip. He had a silver Cartier money clip. I told you about it in passing. I want to come back to it now because it matters later. He had bought it for himself the year he made name partner, in 2011, with his own birthday money, which is a sentence I have always found peculiar, the idea that a 41-year-old man buys himself a Cartier money clip with money his mother sent him for his birthday. But Doug had told that story at our dinner table the Thanksgiving of 2011 3 separate times, and each time he had pulled the money clip out of his pocket and set it on the table while he told the story. And I had quietly hated that money clip from the first time I saw it, in a way I could not have articulated to anybody, including myself, until that Sunday night in late August 22 years into knowing him. The money clip was the joke he was telling all of us, all the time, without ever telling the joke. The night my father died was a Wednesday morning in March of 2014. He died at 6:42 in the morning at Regions Hospital. Karen and I were both there. My mother was there. Doug got to the hospital about 40 minutes after the death because Karen had called him and asked him to come, and he came. He brought coffee. He sat with my mother for about an hour. He held her hand. He was, in that hour, the man I had always assumed Doug was at his best. Quiet, present, useful. And then around 8:30, when the hospital staff brought us the paperwork, there is a tremendous amount of paperwork the morning a man dies. Doug looked at me and at Karen and at my mother and he said, "Listen, let me take this. Let me handle this. None of you should be reading legal documents right now. I'll handle it." And we said, "Thank you, Doug." All three of us said, "Thank you, Doug." And he sat with that clipboard for the next 4 hours in the family room next to the morgue, and he handled it. I do not know. To this day, I cannot tell you whether the decision to drain the trust was made by Doug in that hospital family room on the morning my father died, or whether it had already been made. I have my suspicion. I have my suspicion because of something Doug said to me in the parking lot of the hospital that morning around noon when we were walking out to our cars, and he had clapped me on the shoulder with his right hand and he had said, "Paulie, listen. Don't worry about the trust. Your dad set it up exactly right. Your mom is taken care of. You and Karen are taken care of. I'm going to be right next to all of it." And I had said, "Thanks, Doug. I appreciate that. I really do." And he had nodded and he had gotten into his Range Rover and he had driven away and I had stood in the parking lot in my brown corduroy jacket and watched him drive away. And I have replayed that sentence in my head about 4,000 times in the 11 years since, and I do not think Doug said it as a man making a promise. I think Doug said it as a man already planning a withdrawal. But I did not know that, of course, until that Sunday in late August. And on the Monday morning after that Sunday in late August, I called the credit union my father had used for 40 years. I drove there at lunch. I parked in the back. I went inside. I told the teller I needed copies of every trust statement on the account for the last 4 years, and I told her I was authorized as a successor beneficiary. She asked me for ID. She asked me to wait. She came back about 20 minutes later with a manila folder about an inch thick. She slid it across the counter. She said, "Mr. Sutter, I'm sorry for what happened to your mother." And I said, "Thank you." And I took the folder out to my Civic. And I drove back to the school. And I sat in the parking lot of the school for 10 minutes before I went back inside, because I needed my hands to stop shaking. I read those statements at my own kitchen table that night. I am a chemistry teacher. I know how to read a number. I went line by line, page by page, quarter by quarter, 15 statements going back to the first quarter after my father's death. And what I found was this: 14 quarterly transfers ranging from $9,400 to $14,200 every quarter for 38 months to a single payee. The payee was Vance Consulting LLC. The total was $387,000. And then on top of that, in a single block transfer in March of 2023, was an additional $98,000 to the same payee on the same line marked Real Estate Consultation, Wisconsin. I sat with that line for a long time. The next night I went to the Minnesota Secretary of State website. I am a chemistry teacher. I do not know my way around the Secretary of State website. It took me about an hour to find what I needed. Vance Consulting LLC. Registered November 14, 2021, 6 weeks before the first quarterly transfer. Registered to a UPS store mailbox in St. Paul. Sole member listed on the registration document, Douglas A. Vance. His middle name was Allen. He never used it. Nobody used it. He had not introduced himself as Douglas Allen Vance to a human being since his college fraternity initiation in the spring of 1989. And he had used it here, on this document, to make the LLC searchable only by somebody who already knew what to look for. And I made myself a small, dry promise out loud at my own kitchen table at midnight that Monday. I said, I am not going to take this personally. I am going to take this very, very precisely. The third thing I needed to find, the Wisconsin one, took me until Wednesday night. I am not going to walk you through how I found it because the details are boring. And the point isn't how, the point is what. The point is that $98,000 of my mother's trust money had been used 2 years earlier to buy a small 2-bedroom cabin on Lake Holcomb in Chippewa County, Wisconsin, deeded to Vance Consulting LLC, paid for with a single wire from the trust account at the credit union. I found the property in the county assessor's online database in about 20 minutes. I sat at my own kitchen table and I looked at the satellite photo of that cabin for I do not know how long. It was a small brown cabin on the south shore. There was a small dock. There was a small aluminum boat tied to the small dock. I had never been to that cabin. Karen had never been to that cabin. I am going to come back to that cabin later because it matters. I want to be clear about what I knew by Wednesday night of that week. I knew that my brother-in-law, on top of his estate planning practice and his Range Rover and his Cartier money clip and his country club membership, had used my mother's trust to pay himself approximately $487,000 over 38 months. I knew that he had registered the LLC in a middle name nobody used. I knew that he had bought a small cabin in Wisconsin he had never told my sister about. I knew that he was a federally registered estate planning attorney with 28 years of practice and an active license, and that what he had done was, by the Minnesota State Bar's own rules, which I had read on the State Bar website at 11:30 on a Wednesday night in my kitchen, a violation of his fiduciary duty as a trustee. I knew that the Internal Revenue Service had a whistleblower program. I knew that the State Bar had a complaints process. I knew that the probate court had jurisdiction over trustee misconduct. I knew that all three of those things could be initiated by exactly one person, namely, a beneficiary of the trust, who was me. And what I did not yet know, but which arrived at me very slowly across the next 48 hours, sitting at that same kitchen table at midnight on a Thursday and a Friday in the last week of August, what I did not yet know was the order they had to happen in. And right there, at my mother's kitchen table, no, at my own kitchen table, in the slanting light of a desk lamp, at 1 a.m. on a Friday in late August, I made the decision that everything else would come from. The decision was, I would do this myself. I would not tell Karen. I would not tell my mother. I would not tell a single person at my school. I would retain one attorney in another state and pay him in cash, and I would draft 3 documents over the course of the fall and the winter, and I would file them all in 1 week of the following May. And in the meantime, every other Sunday at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I would put on my brown corduroy jacket, and I would drive out to Wayzata, and I would eat the roast Karen had slightly overcooked, and I would smile at the man at the head of the table. The first Sunday after I made that decision, I put on the brown corduroy jacket, and I drove out to Wayzata, and I rang the doorbell at 3 o'clock on the dot. Karen opened the door. She had flour on the side of her cheek. She kissed me on the temple and she said, "Paulie, you're early." And I said, "Couldn't sleep last night, ran out of stuff to do at home." And she laughed and she said, "Doug's in the office on a call. He'll be done in 10. And I walked through the foyer of that 5-bedroom house on the lake, and I sat on the leather couch in their family room, and I waited. Doug came out at 3:15. He had a folder in his hand. He sat down across from me at the kitchen island, and he slid it across the granite. He said, "Paulie, I've got a couple things for you to sign. Power of attorney stuff for your mom. Routine. Now that she's in the facility, we just want to make sure I've got authority to keep the bills going on her side. And I want you to understand what was happening in my head at that moment, because I had not anticipated it." The man across the granite island from me was sliding paperwork at me in the same casual way he had slid the bottle of wine across the table when I'd first met him in 2002. And every form in that folder was, in some sense, the same form. It was the form that said, "Paul will sign whatever I put in front of him." And I had been signing it for 22 years. I took the pen. I read every page. Doug watched me read every page, and after about the 3rd page he said, "Paulie, you don't have to read every word." And I said, "I know, Doug. I just like to read them. Old habit, chemistry teachers. And he laughed, and he said, "Suit yourself." And I signed every form. And then I took a glass of wine from Karen, and I sat at the dining room table, and I ate the roast, and I went home. I want you to understand what I was doing the entire time I was reading those forms. I was reading them, and I was memorizing them, not the body of each forms. The format of each form, the letterhead, the font, the signature block at the bottom, the notary stamp on the last page. The case management number Doug's paralegal had penciled into the upper right corner of each one. I was a chemistry teacher in his brother-in-law's kitchen at 3:30 on a Sunday afternoon, and I was learning the visual signature of every document that came out of Doug's office, because I knew, even then, that I was going to need to recognize one and act on it when it came across to me later. That night I opened a new Gmail account. I did not use my own name. I used a name I had made up, a perfectly plausible name, the kind of name a chemistry teacher in a Minneapolis suburb might have, but a name that was not mine. I will not tell you what name I used. I am keeping that. I opened the Gmail account on a laptop I had bought, used, with cash, from a refurbished electronics shop in St. Paul 2 days earlier. I bought a yellow legal pad at a Walgreens 2 suburbs over, also with cash. I bought a box of black Bic pens at the same Walgreens. I drove home. I sat at my own kitchen table, and I wrote, at the top of the first page of that legal pad, in block letters, the word inventi, and I underlined it twice. And then I sat at that table for the next 2 hours and I wrote down everything I had, every line item from every quarterly statement, every transfer date, the LLC registration number, the Wisconsin parcel ID, the UPS store mailbox address in St. Paul, in the careful, slow hand of a man who has graded 28 quizzes a night for 26 years and knows that legibility is a kind of respect for the future reader. Even if the future reader is yourself, the next thing I needed was a lawyer who did not live in Minnesota, because Minnesota's estate planning bar is small. Doug knew every probate attorney within 40 miles of downtown Minneapolis. Doug had golfed with most of them. Doug had been a guest speaker at the Minnesota State Bar's annual Estate Planning Continuing Legal Education Conference for 9 of the last 12 years. If I retained a lawyer in St. Paul, the lawyer would, within 72 hours, mention to somebody at the country club that a client had come in asking interesting questions about successor trustees, and Doug would hear about it within 96 hours, and the operation would be over before it had started. So in the first week of October, I drove to Chicago. I drove on a Saturday. I told Karen I was going to a chemistry teacher's professional development weekend, which was, technically, true. There was such a weekend. I had registered for it. My school district had reimbursed half of the mileage. I went to the Friday night opening session. I went to one workshop on Saturday morning. And then at noon on Saturday, while my colleagues were having lunch at the conference hotel, I walked 4 blocks down Wacker Drive to a coffee shop in the Loop, and I sat at a small table by the window, and at 12:15 a man named Marcus Liao sat down across from me. Marcus is 58 years old. He is a probate and trust litigator. He was a senior partner at a firm in Chicago for 22 years and went out on his own 4 years ago, which was the part I cared about, because going out on your own at 54 meant he didn't owe anybody any favors anymore. He had been recommended to me by a college friend, a man I had not spoken to in 6 years, who I'd called from a payphone outside a CVS in Eagan 2 weeks earlier, who had said, "Paul, if you need somebody who is not from your town, Marcus Liao is the guy. He is the most boring lawyer I have ever met." That is a compliment, and I had said, "That is what I am looking for." Marcus ordered an Americano. He drank it black. He listened to me for the first 90 minutes without interrupting, taking notes on a yellow legal pad of his own, in handwriting I could not read upside down. When I was done, he said, "Mr. Sutter, I want to ask you 3 questions, and I want you to answer them honestly, because I will know if you don't. And he asked me whether I was angry, and I said, I am not angry, I am exact. And he asked me whether I wanted to hurt my sister, and I said, I do not. I want to take her husband off of her trust, and out of her finances, and out of her future. What that does to her marriage is not for me to decide. And he asked me whether I wanted money, and I said, I want my mother's care covered until the day she dies. I want my sister's half. I want my half. I want the cabin in Wisconsin sold. And I want Mr. Vance to never sign a power of attorney again in the state of Minnesota or anywhere else. That is the only money I want. And Marcus looked at me for a long moment over the rim of his Americano, and he said very quietly, Mr. Sutter, you don't pay me enough to ask whether you're sure. And I laughed for the first time in 6 weeks, and I said, Mr. Liao, I will pay you whatever you ask. Send me the engagement letter. He sent it 3 days later to my non-named Gmail account. I printed it out at my own house, signed it, scanned it back to him with the scanner I had bought used at the same refurbished shop in St. Paul. I paid the retainer in a single cashier's check I obtained at a small credit union in Eden Prairie, not the credit union my father had used, a different one, using money I had quietly moved out of a savings account I had kept for a roof replacement I had been putting off for 6 years. The retainer was $28,000. I wrote the check. I sent it. I did not feel anything about writing it, except the same thing I felt every November when I paid my property taxes. It was a number. It was a quarterly transfer. It was the cost of being precise. Across the next 8 weeks, Marcus and one of his analysts, a younger woman named Priya whose voice I heard exactly 4 times on conference calls, went through every document I had. They built a forensic accounting. They built a timeline. They built an exhibit list. They had me drive to Chicago 2 more times, in November and in early December, each time under cover of a different teacher conference excuse. And each time I sat at the same small table by the window of that coffee shop on Wacker Drive, and each time Marcus had a thicker folder. And in the middle of November, the second thing happened, the thing I had not been looking for. It was a Sunday in Wayzata, November 19th. I remember the date because it was the Sunday before Thanksgiving, and Karen was already cooking ahead. There were 3 pies on the counter when I came in. Doug came out of his office at 3:20 with a folder and he said, Paulie, 2 more for you. Routine stuff. Mom's facility billing authorization for the new quarter. And he slid the folder across the granite, and I took the pen. The first form was the billing authorization. I read it. I signed it. The second form was a Medicare supplemental rider election. I read it. I signed it. And as I was closing the folder, a small piece of paper slid out from between the 2 forms and landed on the floor next to my chair. I picked it up. It was a Marriott Renaissance hotel room keycard sleeve, the kind they hand you at the front desk with your room number written on it. The handwriting on the room number was not Doug's. The handwriting was a woman's handwriting, and the room number was 1418. And clipped to the back of the sleeve, with a small paper clip, was a credit card receipt for 2 glasses of wine at the hotel bar. The signature on the credit card receipt was Doug's. The date on the credit card receipt was the previous Friday, and the cardholder name was Doug's. But underneath the signature, in the same woman's handwriting that had written the room number, was a small note. It said, "Next time order the cab, XOE." I stared at that piece of paper for about 3 seconds, and I closed the folder, and I slid the small piece of paper into the inside pocket of my brown corduroy jacket. And I handed the folder back to Doug, and I said, "All set, Doug. Anything else?" And he said, "Nope, thanks, Paulie, you're a champ." And I took a glass of wine from Karen, and I sat at the dining room table. And I ate the roast. In my Civic on the drive home that night, in the dark, on Highway 12, I said one word out loud. I said the letter on the note. I said, E, and I drove the rest of the way home in silence. And I sat at my own kitchen table at midnight, and I copied the receipt and the keycard sleeve onto my new scanner, and I uploaded the scans to the non-named Gmail account, and I emailed them to Marcus. And the subject line of the email said, "New exhibit, low priority for the trust file. Tell me what you make of it." Marcus called me on Tuesday morning on my prep period on a burner cell phone I had bought at a Target on Highway 169 a month earlier. He said, "Paul." The card was used at the Marriott Renaissance in St. Paul on the date in question. The room was booked under a name. The name was Erin Halverson. I asked Priya to run her. She is a paralegal at a different downtown firm than your brother-in-law's. She is 31. She is unmarried. She has been a paralegal there for 4 years. We have, at this point, no other information. Do you want it? And I sat at my desk in the empty chemistry lab on the second floor of a 1957 brick building, with the periodic table on the wall above me and the smell of the sodium hydroxide from the previous period's lab still in the air, and I said, "Yes, get it, and keep it separate from the trust file. That one's for me." And he said, "Understood." And he hung up. Across 9 evenings at my own kitchen table in late January, I drafted the Minnesota State Bar complaint. I want to walk you through the shape of those evenings, because the shape mattered to me. I would come home from school at 4:30. I would grade quizzes until 6. I would make dinner, usually something simple, eggs on toast, a soup, and I would eat at the kitchen table while I read whatever novel I was on at the time. I was reading Marilynne Robinson that January, Lila and then Jack, slowly, 1 chapter a night, because I have always believed that a man who reads carefully will think carefully, and I needed to be thinking carefully. And then at 8 o'clock, I would close the novel, and I would clear the dishes, and I would lay out Marcus's exhibit binder on the left side of the table, and Priya's forensic accounting on the right side of the table, and the State Bar complaint template on the laptop in the middle. And I would write for 2 hours, and at 10 o'clock I would close the laptop and go to bed. I did this for 9 evenings. The complaint, when it was finally done, was 17 pages. The forensic accounting attached as Exhibit A was 41 pages. Exhibit B was the LLC registration in Doug's middle name, the lead exhibit, the one that made the case impossible to argue around, and that was the small, dry promise I had made out loud at my own kitchen table back in August, finally cashing itself in on the 7th page of a bar complaint. Exhibit C was the Wisconsin cabin deed. Exhibits D through N were the 14 quarterly transfers, line by line, with bank-stamped page numbers Marcus's analyst had obtained through a legitimate subpoena Marcus had filed under a Cook County, Illinois fact-finding cover Marcus was permitted to file because of a related jurisdiction allowance I do not entirely understand but trusted entirely. The IRS Form 201 was the second thing. I filed it in the second week of February. I drove 45 minutes to a UPS store in Edina, and I opened a P.O. box in my own name. I filled out the Form 2111 by hand at my own kitchen table over the course of one Saturday afternoon. I attached photocopies of the same exhibit binder Marcus had built. I attached a cover letter, 2 pages typed, in clean professional prose, laying out the facts in the careful, slow way I would have laid out a chemistry lab procedure for a 10th grader. I sent it certified mail to the IRS whistleblower office in Ogden, Utah. The return address on the envelope was the P.O. box. I filed it under my real name because the IRS pays a percentage to the whistleblower, and I had decided, sitting with it for one whole night in early January, that I was going to take it. I felt nothing about that decision. I felt the way a man feels when he measures a beaker for the second time before he pours. The probate motion was the third thing. Marcus drafted it. It was a Minnesota state court filing, and Marcus, being licensed in Illinois, retained local counsel in Minneapolis to file it. He did not retain the local counsel until April. He told me, on a phone call in the first week of March, "Paul, This last lawyer is the one piece of this you can't keep at arm's length forever. He will know your name. He will know your sister's name. But he is a man I have used 3 times in the last 7 years, and he is the most boring lawyer I have ever met. That is a compliment. And I had said, Mr. Liao, retain him. And Marcus had laughed very quietly. And the local council was retained in the 2nd week of April, and the motion was finalized and sitting on his desk ready to file on the 2nd Monday of May. The manila envelope for Karen was the 4th thing. I did not start building it until April because I wanted to be entirely sure I would not use it. I want to tell you that honestly. I wanted to give myself the option of unmaking it, all the way up to the morning I would have to mail it. Aaron Halvorson's name was in the inside pocket of my brown corduroy jacket from November 19th until April 11th. I did not act on it for 143 days. What I built in April was small. I built it across 4 evenings. Inside the envelope I put 4 things. 1. A photocopy of the Marriott Renaissance receipt with the woman's handwriting at the bottom. 2. A single typed page, 6 sentences long, no name, no return address, that laid out the date, the hotel, the room number, and Aaron's name and place of work. 3. A copy of Priya's separate 1-page report on Aaron, the dates of 3 additional charges to Doug's personal credit card at the same Marriott across the preceding 14 months, the dates of 2 flight charges to Aaron's name on Doug's American Express, and the dates of 4 restaurant charges Marcus had been able to confirm independently. 4. A small handwritten note, in disguised handwriting, that said 1 line. The line said, "He used your mother's trust to pay for the cabin he took her to in Wisconsin in October. You deserve to know before any of this got loud." I mailed the envelope on a Saturday afternoon in late April from a USPS collection box outside a Quick Trip gas station in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. I drove 90 miles to mail it from a different state, so the postmark would not be Minnesota, and the envelope was addressed in the same printed wedding invitation script Marcus had recommended I use, to Karen's home address, not to her work. I wanted her to read it alone in her own kitchen. I wanted her to read it before Doug got home. I had timed the envelope, through some quiet conversations with Karen at the previous Sunday's dinner, to arrive on a Thursday, because Karen worked from home on Thursdays. And then I waited 2 weeks. Monday, May 12th, Marcus's local counsel walked into the Minnesota State Probate Court at 9:14 in the morning and filed nothing. He had been instructed to file nothing yet. Instead, in the same building, on the 3rd floor, the Minnesota State Bar's intake office received a thick certified envelope at 9:32 in the morning, signed for by an intake clerk, addressed to the bar's Office of Lawyers' Professional Responsibility. The envelope contained the 17-page complaint and the 41-page forensic accounting and exhibits A through N. The complaint had been mailed the previous Friday from Marcus's office in Chicago. Tuesday, May 13th, at 2:40 in the afternoon, Doug Vance received a letter, hand-delivered to his window office overlooking the IDS Center, on the letterhead of the Minnesota State Bar's Office of Lawyers' Professional Responsibility, informing him that an interim suspension of his license was being recommended pending a hearing scheduled for the following month, and that effective at the close of business that day he was relieved of all trustee duties on file with the bar pending the outcome of that hearing. Karen called me at 3:45 to ask if I had heard. I had not. Her voice was very tight. She said, "Paulie, it's bad. It's really bad. Something's happened with one of Doug's files." And I said, "Karen, tell me." And she said, "I don't know yet. He's not telling me yet. He says he's going to fix it." And I said, "Karen, whatever you need, I'm here." And we hung up. Wednesday, May 14th, at 11:02 in the morning, the Internal Revenue Service's whistleblower office in Ogden, Utah, opened a parallel inquiry under file number, and I know this number because Marcus told it to me on a phone call 8 months later, file number ending in 7381. The IRS does not, as a courtesy, inform the subject of a parallel inquiry. The subject finds out when the certified letter arrives at his home address. The certified letter at the home address would not arrive until the following Tuesday. Doug had no idea on Wednesday that the IRS was now part of this. Thursday, May 15th. Karen received the manila envelope at 11:50 in the morning in the mail at her home in Wayzata, where she was working from home, as she did every Thursday. She opened it at her kitchen island, alone. She read everything. She called her best friend first. Then she called her divorce attorney, and the divorce attorney she called was, as it turned out, the same attorney who had handled her college roommate's divorce 3 years earlier. And the divorce attorney was at a yoga class on Thursday mornings and called Karen back at 1:30. By 3 in the afternoon, the divorce attorney had Doug's name and Marriott receipts on a printer in her downtown office. By 4:30, Karen had changed the locks on the lake house in Wayzata. By 6 o'clock, 2 suitcases of Doug's clothes were on the front porch. Doug, at 6 o'clock, was in a conference room at his own firm with 2 senior partners and an outside ethics counsel, and his phone was in the pocket of his Range Rover in the parking garage on the 3rd floor. Friday, May 16th, at 10:08 in the morning, Marcus's local counsel walked into Hennepin County Probate Court and filed the motion to remove Douglas A. Vance as successor trustee of the Diane M. Sutter Revocable Living Trust, on the basis of 17 documented breaches of fiduciary duty enumerated in exhibits attached. The motion requested an emergency lis pendens on the Wisconsin cabin pending final disposition. Marcus called me at 3 in the afternoon. He said, "Paul, the motion is in. The cabin goes on the lis pendens by Monday." And I said, "Mr. Leo, thank you." And he said, "Paul, listen to me. You paid me exactly enough to do this right, and that is rarer than you think." And we hung up. That night, a colleague of Doug's from the firm, a woman Karen had known for 15 years, who had walked Karen through the early hours of her own first child's NICU stay in 2011, sent Karen a photograph from her phone. The photograph was of Doug's window office. The office had been emptied. The office had a single envelope sitting in the middle of the desk, and behind the envelope, sitting on the bare wood, was the silver Cartier money clip, left there, as best as anybody could tell, by Doug on Tuesday afternoon when he had walked out of his office and not come back. The plating on one corner of the money clip, and you can see this in the photograph, which Karen forwarded to me Saturday morning without comment, had started to wear off. That same Friday night, at 10:47 p.m., my phone rang. I was sitting in my own kitchen, at my own table, with my laptop closed and a cup of tea cooling next to me. The screen said, "Doug." I let it ring 3 times, then I answered. There was no sound on the other end. There was no sound on the other end for almost a minute. I could hear him breathing. I could hear, in the background, the small mechanical noise of an HVAC unit running in what I assumed was a hotel room. A hotel room, presumably, that was not the one he had spent 14 previous nights in at the Marriott Renaissance. I did not speak first. I sat at my kitchen table with the phone to my ear and I waited. After about 50 seconds, he said one word. He said, "Paulie." He did not say anything after that. And I sat there at my own kitchen table at 10:45 on a Friday night in May, and I held the phone to my ear and I did not speak. And then after about another 30 seconds, he hung up, and I sat at my own kitchen table for a long, long time. I did not cry. I did not feel triumph. I felt nothing in particular except a kind of cold, slow quiet in the middle of my chest. And then I got up, and I rinsed my teacup, and I dried my teacup, and I put it back in the cabinet, and I drove to my mother's empty house in the dark, and I sat in the driveway for a long, long time. I want to tell you about that Saturday morning, because that is the morning that actually matters. The Friday night, the bank, the IRS, the envelope, Doug's silent phone call at 10:47, that was the machine running. I had built the machine and the machine ran. There is a way in which none of that week was the hard part. The hard part was the Saturday morning afterwards. I woke up at 5:31 in the morning in the south half of a duplex on a quiet street. I made coffee. I did not eat breakfast. I put on my brown corduroy jacket. The elbows were worn through. I still had not gotten them repatched. I drove to a Barnes & Noble in Eden Prairie that opened at 7, and I bought a paperback copy of Hannah Coulter by Wendell Berry, which my father had loved and which my father had read aloud one summer to my mother on the screened-in porch of a cabin we used to rent on the North Shore when I was 12 years old. The clerk at the register handed me my change and the receipt, and she smiled at me in the way clerks smile at men in worn corduroy jackets on a Saturday morning, and I drove 15 minutes to my mother's memory care facility in Eden Prairie, and I signed in at the front desk at 7:38. The receptionist knew me. She did not say anything more than her usual good morning. She did not know that anything in the world had changed that week. As far as she was concerned, the brother of the Sunday afternoon visitor had simply shown up on a Saturday morning instead, which in some sense was the entire shape of my life. A man who showed up the way he had always showed up, just on a different day of the week. My mother was in her chair by the window. She was wearing the soft blue cardigan one of the aides put on her every morning. She was looking out the window at a small garden where the bird feeders had been refilled the day before. She did not turn her head when I came in. She did not turn her head when I sat down in the chair next to hers. I leaned over and I kissed the top of her head where her hair had thinned, and I said, "Hi, Mom, it's Paul." And she made a small sound that did not mean anything. I opened Hannah Coulter to chapter 4. I read for 2 hours. I read slowly. I read at the pace my father had read at, on the screened-in porch of a rented cabin 40 years earlier. I read through the part where Hannah remembers, near the end of her life, her first husband Virgil and the war and the small farm in Kentucky, and the way she remembers him is not as grief, but as a quiet kind of accounting, a way of saying, this is what was. My mother did not know what I was reading. She did not know who I was. She closed her eyes for parts of it. She opened them. She looked at a sparrow that landed on the windowsill. She made another small sound. I kept reading. When I closed the book at 9:45, she had been asleep for about 20 minutes. I sat in the chair next to hers for another half hour. And I thought about what I had just done, in the way you think about things when you have the time and the room. And I figured out something on that Saturday morning that I am still trying to put into words. I figured out that I had not become the man who folded the statement back into the envelope on a Tuesday in late August. I had been the man who folded the statement back into the envelope on a Tuesday in late August. He had been inside me the whole time. He had been waiting. For 36 years he had been waiting, all the way back to a 10th grade chemistry lab in 1989 when Mr. Lindgren, who had hands like leather and a Norwegian accent he had never lost, stood next to my bench while I was titrating something and said, "Paul, the measurement is the work, son. Everything else is showing off." I was 16 years old. I have thought about that sentence almost every day of my life since. I thought about it while I was grading quizzes. I thought about it while I was raising no children of my own. I thought about it while I was watching my niece dance with me in a gym instead of with her father. And on that Saturday morning at 10:15 in a memory care facility in Eden Prairie, with my mother asleep in the chair next to mine, I thought about it again. And I understood that the man Mr. Lindgren had seen in me at 16, the man who could measure twice, the man who could sand a corner 40 times, was the same man who had sat at his kitchen table for 9 months and not told a single human being. The craft is the craft. It doesn't care what you point it at. And that, I think, is why I felt what I felt that Saturday morning. Because if patience is a craft, then I am very, very good at it. And being very, very good at it means I am capable of things most people are not capable of. And that is not a comforting thing to know about yourself. Karen called me at 3 o'clock on Sunday afternoon. She had been crying. I had expected the call to be longer than it was. The call lasted 4 minutes. She said, "Paulie, did you know?" and I said very carefully, Karen, I want to tell you the truth. I knew about the trust. I have known since August. I did what I did the way I did it because I did not know how else to do it. And she was quiet on the line for a long time. And then she said very quietly, did you send the envelope? And I said yes. And she was quiet for a long time again. And then she said, I have to go. And she hung up. I have not been back to a Sunday dinner in Wayzata since. Karen and I trade short emails about my mother's care. We are not friends. I am not sure whether we will ever be friends again. I am okay with that. The probate court unwound the trust over the course of the following 12 weeks. Doug's interim suspension became a final disbarment 11 months later, after a hearing at which he was represented by an attorney from out of state who, by every report, did his honest best with a file that no honest lawyer could have argued around. The cabin on Lake Holcomb sold in late August for $214,000. The trust recovered $431,000 of the $487,000 it had lost. The remainder went to attorney's fees, including mine. My mother's care is now funded through her natural life. Karen's half is in a separate account. My half is in a separate account. The IRS, by the way, did pay out on the Form 211. I got the check 14 months after I mailed the package. It was for $36,000. I gave most of it to a small foundation in St. Paul that funds legal aid for elderly people whose families are stealing from them. I kept enough to repatch the elbows of my brown corduroy jacket. The seamstress charged me $38. Doug did not go to prison. The IRS settled with him civilly. He paid back the tax. He is, as of this past March, working as a paralegal at a smaller firm in a different state. I have not seen him. I have not spoken to him. My mother died on a Tuesday in October. The doctor called me at school at 11:14 in the morning during my third period AP class. I excused myself. I drove to Eden Prairie. I sat with her body for an hour before they came to take her. She had not, at any point in the 4 months between the Saturday I had read her Hannah Coulter and the Tuesday she died, ever recognized me again. I want to tell you what I figured out sitting next to her that morning. My father asked me one thing the year before he died. I do not think I have told you this. He asked me, on a Saturday afternoon on his back porch in St. Paul in the summer of 2013, with a glass of iced tea in his hand and the bees in the hostas at his feet, to look after Karen. He said it like a man asking a small favor. He did not mean from the inside of her marriage. He did not know he had to. But what he asked me was to look after her, and I did, in the only way I knew how, and she is never going to thank me for it. And I'll tell you this. The first impulse I had at my mother's kitchen table on a Tuesday in late August was to drive immediately to Wayzata and put the statement on Karen's countertop and say, look at this. The second impulse was to call Doug himself and ask him a question. If I had done either one of those things, none of the rest of it would have happened. Doug would still be a partner at his firm. The cabin would still be his. Karen would still be his wife. My mother's care would still be drained by a little every quarter until she died. And so I folded the statement back into the envelope, and I smiled at him across the dining room table the next Sunday, and I did what my father asked me to do. That's the only thing my father ever asked me to do, and I did it. And I am not going to tell you it felt good. Thanks for watching Ruthless Retribution.